One of the things I love about being a Unitarian Universalist is our belief that revelation is not sealed, that insights into the sacred and the holy, the nature of God and humanity are found in multiple stories, multiple sources, scriptural and traditional, individual and experiential, cultural and collective. And this means that even primetime television is fair game for sermon fodder. So Arden and I have enjoyed sharing a number of fantasy novels of late. And these stories have reminded me that for a time, my guilty pleasure was fantasy TV. Now, we could say that all TV is fantasy, but specifically 2 TV shows that were based on fairy tales were my great delight. Perhaps you remember them from before they were canceled a few years ago, Grimm and Once Upon a Time. If you missed them, the New York Times review sums them up pretty well. Grimm was a, quote, buddy cop crime drama with fairy tale monsters. Once Upon a Time was a primetime soap and romantic comedy with fairy tale heroes and villains. Now, I love these shows because I was fascinated by how they retold the ancient tales in this modern medium. Cinderella was there, and Rumpelstiltskin, Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, who we saw this morning, and more. Grimm reimagined the Brothers Grimm and their descendants as powerful fighters who subdued the fairy tale creatures whose tales they recorded. These were shape-shifting monsters that still lived among us in human disguise. The latest Grimm descendant happened to be a police detective who skirted the line between traditional and fantastical crime fighting. The big bad wolf lived. The hero was always victorious. And Once Upon a Time was centered around the story of Snow White and her evil stepmother, who took the rivalry with her stepdaughter so far as to curse the entire fairy tale realm, banishing all the fairy tale creatures to the real world and imprisoning them in a small town in Maine with no recollection of their true identities. The characters were intentionally complex, challenging our conceptions of who is good and who is evil. For years, I have been intrigued by the ways that our content producers, the TV networks, the Hollywood studios, retell these same stories again and again, and how we, the public, eat them up with relish. Think of the box office phenomena of such live-action films as Beauty and the Beast, Snow White and the Huntsman, Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Giant Slayer, Sleeping Beauty, and Cinderella, and Cinderella, and Cinderella. Not to mention the animated versions of all these films and the animated remakes of all these films. The same stories again and again. What are we looking for as we seek out these stories? What draws us to them, and what are we hoping to draw out of them? As a culture, we revel in classic tales that span time and geography, tales that have become part of our canon, revered in a sense because, like the stories of the Bible or other sacred texts, these tales point to the truth of our human experience. They describe the reality of human despair and the very real dangers of our world, and at the same time, they lift up the power of human perseverance and resilience. Tell me a story of deep delight, the poet says. And as so many of us know, any true story of delight comes tinged with pain, salted with sorrow. In this century, Robert Penn Warren wrote in the middle of the last century, in this century and this moment of mania, tell me a story. And then he tells us a story. The poem captures a moment, a fleeting moment, dark without a moon, as a boy listens to birds as they fly north, and his heart leaps with them. Penn Warren's poem is the essence of storytelling. A great story captures a specific place and yet tells of great distances. A great story points to one moment in time and yet is timeless, always pointing to the ultimate story we tell over and over. The story of time, he says. The story of truth. Now, as a congregational community, we make our way through a year together and we tell each other stories. We tell stories of the seasons, of the earth growing dormant, and then with great fanfare awakening again. We tell each other stories of memory and loss as we share photos of our departed beloveds in the fall and commemorate Memorial Day each spring. We tell stories of a babe in arms who brought peace to war-torn lands and pray for peace in our own time at Christmas time. We tell and we retell the stories of our Unitarian Universalist forebearers. When we resume our Passover Seder here at UUCA, we will tell again the ancient story of oppression and liberation. We will taste once again the bitter herbs and salt water that make real the tears and sorrow of the Israelites in bondage in Egypt. And then we will taste the haroset, that sweet mixture of apples and nuts, and be reminded again of the sweetness of life in the midst of hardship. At Easter, we tell and retell stories of political dissent, of murder and resurrection, mixed in, of course, with stories of goddesses and bunnies and chocolate eggs. And through it all, we tell our stories. We tell our experiences and our hardships, our losses and our resilience. We tell stories of our individual lives, and as Tony shared so beautifully with us this morning, we tell powerful stories of our collective history to remind us who we are, a striving, thriving, and loving community. Our children listen to the stories we tell. They are experts at extracting truth from tales of all sorts. The late movie critic Roger Ebert used to say, "Kids are not stupid. They are among the sharpest, cleverest, most eagle-eyed creatures on God's earth," he wrote in his 1971 review of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, that now iconic film adaptation of Roald Dahl's book. Reflecting on the gruesome nature of the fates of the children admitted to Willy Wonka's factory, you'll remember the greedy boy who falls into the chocolate lake and is whisked away into the bowels of the factory. You'll remember the annoying girl who blows up like a blueberry when she pops that prototype piece of gum into her mouth, and on and on. Ebert reminds us that all great children's tales are a little gruesome, and that we know that most children, in fact, do appreciate poetic justice when a bad kid gets what's coming to them. Truth is, all great children's tales are a little gruesome, the Grimm brothers' tales especially. The unfortunate first ending of Rosie's story this morning is nothing compared to the original tales as collected by Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm and translated from the German. They are horrific. So horrific that with children's ears in the audience today, I'm not gonna do it. I have it written here, but I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna say the fate of the villain's fate is worse than the fate of the heroes. They are certainly not how the stories were told to me. Not by Walt Disney, not by my parents, and not even by the brothers Grimm, who by popular demand modified many of the traditional oral tales they had collected in order to be more child-friendly. I mean, hundreds of years ago they did that. Can you imagine? We want to protect our children. We want to protect our children from violence and from gore, and in so many ways, we should do just that. The world is at least 50% terrible. Reverend Taryn read that poem last week. And that's a conservative estimate, the poet Maggie Smith writes, though I keep this from my children. The ancient tales, though, do not shy away from the truth that the world can be a treacherous place and that children, too, can face evil and violence no matter how much we want to protect them. And we know that at some point we will no longer be able to do so, and they will discover this truth for themselves. The frustration, the despair at discovering the world as it is versus the world according to mom and dad, or the world according to my parents, the world as it should be, or the world as we wish it could be, happens to all of us. For some of us as very young children. For some, there is no protection, no parental buffer, no shelter of race or of class. For others, the privilege of innocence persists into adulthood. Now, most of us, though, can identify a time or times when the scales fell from our eyes and the grim realities of our world were revealed in sharp relief. And for many of us, the ancient archetypal stories are part of that process. Maria Tartar, a scholar of fairy tales and legends at Harvard University, says that this is not the here or now. It gives us a place to put our imagination to work. Dr. Tartar explained to On Being's Krista Tippett that the great truth behind the terror and ultimate redemption of the traditional fairy tale is that no matter how horrible the monster is, how frightening, the hero survives. The hero will battle that monster, figure out a way to outwit it, to get behind it and push it into the oven rather than being devoured. The fact is that there is a way out, she says, and that fact is one of the great strengths of these tales and a reason why we can tell them to our children without having deep anxieties about how it will damage them in one way or the other. Today's monsters do not have big teeth or a big snout. They do not live in gingerbread houses waiting to eat small children wandering in the wood. They are often, though, scarier than the monsters and witches of the fairy tales. We know all too well the dangers our children face. And so even more important is the once upon a time, as it helps us to look at the harsh reality and harsh actuality of our lives, to join the heroes and heroines in their deliverance, and to figure our own way out. Because something happens to our hearts when we enter the world of the well-told tale. We look back at our own world with new eyes. Theologian Frederick Buechner writes, "Good and evil meet and do battle in the fairy tale world as much as they meet and do battle in our world. But in the fairy tales, the good live happily ever after." The tears that come at the joy of the fairy tale, he says, are essentially joyous tears because what we have caught glimpse of, however fleeting, is joy itself, the triumph, if not of goodness, then at least of hope. When was the last time a story gave you hope? When did a happily ever after lift your hearts or move you to tears? We need our stories, secular and religious, stories that tell us the truth, that show us the world as it is, terrible and beautiful. Life is filled with pain and retribution, fear and regret, disease and death. This we know all too well. And so hope becomes no longer a luxury. Hope becomes necessary for survival. And so we tell our stories. And we find stories of hope and renewal, even in our world as it is. Buechner asserts that the world can give us glimpses of hope and joy as well as fairy tales can. The smell of rain, the dazzle of sun on a white wall, the wildness of a storm in the house, when in the house, the flame on the candle doesn't even flicker. When we open our hearts in faith, there is always somewhere a story of delight. We live in anxious, challenging times. But the truth is, human beings have always lived in anxious, challenging times. I want to share with you now that in preparation for today's service, Leroy generously offered 2 potential pieces of music for me to choose from for our offertory. I could have chosen Pure Imagination from Willy Wonka, which would have fit perfectly. And in fact, in the choose your own adventure that is sermon writing, it led me to that Roger Ebert quote that I referenced earlier. But I didn't choose that song. Instead, I asked Leroy to have Sarah Dawn and Suzanne sing and play Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And you did so beautifully. Thank you. In the 1939 movie adaptation of Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz, which was first published in 1900, the beloved Dorothy Gale is seeking some place where there isn't any trouble. It's far away. It's behind the moon, beyond the rain. It's somewhere over the rainbow. And I chose that song this morning because I wanted desperately to offer you a moment of respite, to offer you a moment of truly pure imagination, if you will, a chance to sail away, a time to dream, to envision, to wish for that place, that world in the midst of it all that we continue to work for, to strive for, to pray for. Why can't our hearts leap with the happy little bluebirds, if only for a moment? If only in our minds, if only in this space, in this time set apart from time. Because we know the once upon a times, but we do not yet know our ever after. The way is drear, and we are frightened and tired and weak and worn. And still our times call for stories, stories that spare none of the truth, none of the pain, and none of the beauty. With your hand in my hand and my hand in our neighbor's hand, let's tell the stories that celebrate our resilience. Let's tell the stories that celebrate our determination and our commitment and our love for each other, for our fellow human beings, for our children, and yes, for our nation, for our planet, and for this bruised and battered world of ours. There will never be a land with no trouble, but there can be and there will be good trouble in this land of ours. We will see to that. There is so much more to tell. Thank you.